We are finishing up John chapter 21. We are finishing up the Gospel of John. It's been a trek. It's been fun in the book of John. John chapter 21 will be at the end. The question is, do you know the purpose of God for your life? Wow. Do you know what God has called you to? Do you know what God has commissioned you for? Lots of Christians, well-meaning, likable Christians, they spend their life chasing after a job. Lots of pastors spend their life chasing after being a pastor. And then they retire and they're lost. Or they lose their job and they say, well, what am I supposed to do with my life now? My life's been all wrapped up with my job. Lots of well-meaning Christians say, well, my purpose, my meaning, my major, what I'm supposed to be on here on earth for is to be married, is to care for my spouse, my husband, my wife, or maybe it's to be a parent, to care for my children and to raise them. And those are good things that are from God, but what happens when you are like Randy and you lose a child? What happens when you lose a spouse? You see, if your purpose, if your calling, if your commission is all wrapped up in even the people who are sitting next to you, you know that people are lost oftentimes when they lose people, yeah? And you wonder how someone who is so stable can lose someone and they can just go to completely unstable. Especially with a spouse. You lose someone like that and it throws you into sort of a tailspin, and you begin to, as you reflect, start to wonder how much was what I thought my purpose was this person who's now no longer here. And then you start going back to God and saying, well, what really was my purpose? And then it's a whole discovery process that you go through. Lots of Christians live their life, and they do a lot of great things. They serve, they teach, they do a lot of great things. But lots of Christians don't necessarily know, what is my purpose? What has God commissioned me for that's not necessarily the same as everybody else? So, just a show of hands real quick. Who would say, I know what God has purposed for my life specifically? Not a general call, not a commission that goes out to all Christians. Who would say, I know what I feel like God has called me to do specifically in my life, my purpose, my calling? Okay, Kent, what would you say? Missions, good. Lori, what would you say? Worship, good. You can do that anywhere. And you can do missions anywhere. You see how missions is not tied to a person, not tied to a profession? He could be a missionary anywhere. He could be a missionary if he's rich. He can be a missionary if he's poor. She can sing and play music if she's rich or poor, has a job, no job, doesn't matter what job she works. That's a constant call on her life from God. You see how it's not tied to a profession, not tied to something that can be lost? It's just simply a call from God. I'm going to challenge you today. The commission that Jesus gives to Peter is a commission for him. And so if we read this text, you should be at the end of this text finishing and going, well, that's great for Peter. What does that have to do with me? Because this commission that we're going to see at the end of John's gospel is for Peter. Now, there's glory in it, and we can read it, and we can look at the restoration of Peter, and we can say, how great is God, restored Peter, this denier, and we can look at all those things, and that's great. You should take away all those things as you read the text. We'll go through them. But what I want to challenge you on this morning, if you've been a Christian for 2 years or 30 years, is do you know what God's calling you to? Do you know what your calling, your purpose, your specific commissioning is? So we're finishing up John's gospel, where this is going to be primarily about the commissioning of Peter. And you're going to watch the commissioning of Peter not be tied to a person. You're going to watch the commissioning of Peter be open-ended, something that he can do no matter where he goes. If he lives till he's 80 or he lives till he's 20, he can accomplish his commission. It's one of the other things that often gets bound. We often pick things that we think God's calling us to, and that's our calling for our life, and then once we get past 40 years old, we realize we can't do that anymore. And then we're lost again. And we're still trying to figure out what is God's actual calling, his actual purpose for me. So let's read it for Peter, and then I'll give you a couple ways so that you can figure it out in your life if you haven't quite figured that out yet. John chapter 21, we left off last week in verse 14, so we'll start with verse 15. The disciples just witnessed a miracle. They were on a lake. Jesus came to them, stayed on the shore, said, "You didn't have any fish yet?" And they said, "No." He says, "Throw it on the right side." And so they throw their net on the right side, and they pull in this huge catch of fish that they can barely get in the boat. And so we see this miracle, and Jesus reveals himself resurrected from the dead to the disciples so that they can understand who he is, the same way he revealed himself to them in Luke chapter 5 at the beginning of his life when he was calling his disciples, so that they know this is Jesus Christ. So John chapter 15, they get back on John chapter 21. They get back on the shore, and they sit down and they have a meal, and then this is what happens next, verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my lambs." This is a familiar passage to most of you. If you've been around church for any length of time, you've read this passage, you know this passage. You know that the commissioning of Peter here, and Jesus is going to ask him 3 times. In verse 15, do you love me more than these? More than these. The question becomes, more than these what? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us exactly what Jesus is referring to. He could be pointing to the fish on the table. Do you love me more than these? And Peter's like, yeah, of course. I mean, it's fish, whatever. He could be pointing to the disciples and saying, do you love me more than you love the people sitting next to you? See, this would have been an important question for Peter, because in Peter's denials, he denied Jesus to people. In other words, when people came asking Peter, "Who do you follow? Aren't you with this guy?" His response was no. In other words, he's saying, I approve more of what you think of me than what that guy thinks of me. And so the question here could be very specific to Peter. Peter, are you willing to say this time you love me more than you love them? Because before you weren't. So are you willing to now say that you love me more than them? We don't know who the these are, but I think no matter what the these are in the text, the question is still this: do you love me more than you love the world? Because no matter what the these are in the text, whether it's the fish or the food that is actually sustenance for his body, or whether it's the disciples sitting around, the these, it has to do with the world. So the question becomes, do you love me more than you love the world? Bottom line. Notice Peter's simplicity, his humility in his response. He simply sits back and says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Lots of people, they question, do I truly believe? Am I truly saved? Do I really know? How do I know? Is my faith genuine? Do I believe enough? Whatever you want to call it. They wrestle with these things. You maybe wrestle with them throughout your life. Maybe you go through a period of living well and you think, I feel pretty secure. And then you go through a period of rebellion and you start to doubt and question. Was my faith genuine? Do I really believe? Do I truly trust God? Simple question that Jesus asked Peter that I'll ask to you too. If Jesus were standing eye to eye, face to face with you, and he were to say to you, do you love me? Could you sit back in your chair and simply say to him, yes, you know that I love you? Could you sit back in your chair to the one who knows whether you're lying or not? He knows what's going through your mind. He knows what you're contemplating. He knows what you're weighing right and left. And could you simply just say to his face, you know that I love you? Simplistic, obedient. If you cannot, if that makes you uncomfortable, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm not really sure, I don't know, that's cause for pause and reevaluation of whether or not you truly believe. There should be a grounding. There should be a peace. There should be a rest. As the world swirls around us, there should be an ability to sit back and say, oh, the world's swirling around me, but that doesn't change what I believe. I'm like, yeah, I'm not really sure what's going to happen tomorrow or with my family, but of course I believe. One simple question that has a simple response. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I do. Not easy to walk out, but it's a simple response. You notice the difference between this and Peter's response before, back in John chapter 13, before Jesus is crucified. Jesus is trying to tell them, I'm going away, and where I'm going, you cannot come. And Peter's like, where are you going? Where are you going? Where are you going? And Jesus says, you can't come. Where I'm going, you cannot come, but you will later. And Peter says, what are you talking about? I would go anywhere with you. I would die with you. Do you hear the urgency in Peter's response? Do you hear him trying to convince Jesus that he would follow him? Do you hear a very different response from Peter here? Before it was, I'll follow you anywhere. I'm committed to you. I'm devoted to you. I'm your right-hand man. I'll go anywhere. I'll die for you. And Jesus says, no, you won't. But now, post-resurrection, Peter sits back. He says, you know that I love you. Do you see the difference? When you're trying to figure out, is my faith genuine? Do I really believe? Is this really true? The question is, if Jesus were to come to you and sit and say, do you love me? Are you trying to convince him that you love me? Look, Jesus, I did this, and I did that, and I did this, and I spent this much time with you, and I read, and I prayed, and I... Are you trying to convince him that you love him, or is there a rest? Is there a peace? Or you just sit back in your chair and say, you know that I love you. No questions. You can have that when your faith is genuine. Then comes the first commission of Peter. Jesus says to him, tend my lambs. And then number 2, verse 16, he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, shepherd my sheep. And then a third time, verse 17. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Lots of people get caught up in this text, in the Greek, in the words, and they get caught up with the different phrases of Jesus and the different phrases of Peter, tend my lambs, shepherd my sheep, tend my sheep. And they look at the Greek and they say, Jesus was asking about agape and agape love, this unconditional kind of love, and they say Peter was responding with this phileo, this kind of brotherly love, and they were going back and forth, and it was disconnect, and then Jesus finally asked him the other sort of love, and so they try to draw all kinds of conclusions on that. I'm going to suggest to you that John gives us the reason why Peter was grieved, and I want you to stay focused on that. John says this, because he said to him a third time, do you love me? Notice what John didn't say. John didn't say, Peter was grieved because Jesus asked him 2 times, do you agape me? And he asked him 1 time, do you phileo me? And so that's why he was grieved. No. He says he asked him 3 times. I'm going to suggest to you that the different phrases that Jesus uses, tend my lambs, shepherd my sheep, tend my sheep, and the words for love that he uses in this passage are interchangeable. They're all synonyms. It's all the same commission. The purpose is not the different words that are used or the different phrases or the way they're put together. The purpose is 3 times. Why 3 times? 3 times is because his confession of loyalty was public. You saw it in John chapter 13. I'll go anywhere with you. I'll follow you. I'll die for you. And he says this in front of the disciples. And then his denial 3 times was public. To the servant girl, the gatekeeper, to some anonymous people by the fire who asked him, are you with this guy? To Malchus, the relative of the guy whose ear got cut off, Roman soldier. Malchus, you're with this guy, right? You're the one who cut my cousin's ear off. No, not me. Confession of loyalty was public. His denial was public. Here, now, in front of the disciples 3 times as part of Peter's restoration. And Peter, no doubt, connects Jesus asking him 3 times to the fact that however many days ago, he denied him 3 times, multiple times. And now notice Jesus' restoration of Peter is also public. The confession of Peter is part of his transformation. The confession that Peter makes is part of his restoration. You're willing to deny me these times? Are you willing to also now demonstrate that you love me the same amount of times? To which Peter says, yes, Lord, you know all things. He's no longer putting on a show for Jesus, no longer trying to convince him that he's his right-hand man, that he's committed to him. He's just simply saying, yes, you know that I love you. Simply, Peter can't deny what's right in front of him. So for you and I, it's a little more difficult, right? We don't have Jesus sitting right in front of us saying, do you love me? But for Peter, he's sitting there looking at him. I saw you die. Now I'm eating fish with you, resurrected from the dead. And the answer is, do you think I'm a ghost? Do you think I'm not real? Are you hallucinating right now? No. I believe. Jesus is then going to prophesy to Peter about his own death. Verse 18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you to where you do not wish to go. And John comments this. Now, he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. By the time John writes his gospel, Peter's most likely already dead. So John is looking back on this interaction with Jesus, and he's going, Jesus told him that this would happen already. And now he's writing it down. Oh, okay, this is good. So now he understands. How many of you in the room have heard that Peter was crucified upside down on a cross? Yeah, lots of hands. How many people know where the source is of that church tradition? There's one. Do you know? Where is it? The Acts of... Okay, try the Acts of Peter. Close, though. You're the only one so far. Well done. How many of you have ever heard of the Acts of Peter? Yeah. All of you, lots of you have heard of the fact that that Peter was crucified upside down on a cross, but nobody seems to know the source. The Acts of Peter is an apocryphal New Testament book. In other words, the early church said this is definitely not Scripture. It was written well after the New Testament books. Let me give you just a survey of what's in this book, and then I'll let you decide how authentic this tradition is that Peter was crucified upside down on a cross. The Acts of Peter record, supposedly, a duel, a magical duel between the Apostle Peter and a guy named Simon Magus. Simon Magus was a magician from the first century. He was a historical person. But he didn't believe in Jesus. He was a mystic. He was a shaman. He was a fake. And so supposedly Simon Magus challenged Peter. Let's see who's more powerful. You say you follow God and you have the Spirit of God. Let's see who's more powerful. And so this book records a magical duel. Heal this sick person, cast out these demons, do this miracle and that miracle, and we'll see who's really the real power here. And so it goes back and forth. And it's in this book of this fanatical historical traditions where we get this at the end of the book that says about Peter being crucified upside down on a cross. Now, if you've never read the Acts of Peter before and you want to try and figure out if this tradition that Peter was crucified upside down on a cross is true or not, go read the book. And when you get about 2 paragraphs in, you'll be like, what? Questionable source. So, before you continue to propagate church history in the church, something like that, just be careful. Because not all these things come from sources that are stellar. The only credible sources, I would say, that we have of what happened to Peter is this prophecy, because John would have been writing after Peter was dead. And so if he writes this down, it's partly a confirmation that it actually happened. Because why would he put something in his gospel that he knows not to be true? So this is actually the most evidence that we have. The other closest evidence, legit ancient sources that we have, simply say that he was martyred. They don't say how. They don't even say where. Simply say he he was martyred. Just food for thought. Jesus says at the end of this verse, follow me. Now, this could be a part of Peter's commissioning. Follow me. The same way that in Luke chapter 5, when he was called at the beginning, they got off on the shore, they put down their nets, and they followed Jesus. Now, this could be part of Peter's commissioning. It could simply be Jesus saying, let's go for a walk, because in the very next verse, they are clearly walking down the beach of the Sea of Galilee. Verse 20, Peter, turning around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, meaning they're walking, Peter and Jesus, at this point. And then more description of the one whom Jesus loved, the one who had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? All descriptions of the same person, the gospel writer. Verse 21, Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this guy? What about that guy? So Peter's just received this prophecy. Oh, tend my sheep, shepherd my lambs, and then you're going to die. For those of you who don't know, being arms stretched out in the ancient world is symbolic of crucifixion. Because those who were sentenced to be crucified were often bound by rope, arms stretched out, and bound on the crossbeam. And then they had to carry, not the whole cross, but the crossbeam, to wherever their place of execution was. And so when Jesus says, you used to gird yourself, which normally talks about putting on clothes, but when you get older, someone else will gird you, wrap you, and take you to a place you do not wish to go. So we do know, at least from this text, Peter was likely crucified. Upside down on a cross. I don't know about that. Jesus says, follow me. And then Peter says, well, what about that guy? I told you a couple weeks ago, John and Peter have this weird thing. I don't know what it is. For some reason, John thinks it's important that you know that he's faster than Peter. And for some reason, in this text, Peter's also concerned about John. Here's an important tip when you're trying to figure out what's your commission for your life. Don't get bogged down worrying about the plan of God for other people's lives. Listen to Jesus' response right after he asked him this question. What about that guy? Jesus says to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. In other words, it doesn't matter what I do with him. You focus on the plan of God for your life. Lots of people want to look around and say, well, the plan of God for his life looks pretty good. I think I'll just go do what he's doing. No. If I let him stay alive for lots of years, what's it to you? If I kill him tomorrow, what's it to you? You follow the plan of God for your life, which is why it becomes essential that we don't look at this story and say, what's the plan of God for Peter's life? Oh, okay, let's go do that. No. You should be, at the end of this text, saying to yourself, who cares what the plan of God for Peter's life is? What's the plan of God for my life? For this simple response right here. If all we do is look at this text and say, what's the plan of God for Peter's life? I think Jesus would give us the same response. If this is the plan of God for Peter's life, what's it to you? You follow God in the plan of God for your life. But how do you go about figuring that out? More on that in a second. Let's finish the text here. John's going to quell some of the rumors that go out as a result of Jesus saying this to Peter. Verse 23, therefore this saying went out among the brethren that that disciple would not die. And that Jesus did not say to him he would not die, but only if I want him to remain until I come, what is it to you? And John's just going to set the record straight here. Rumors went out, that disciple's not going to die. John says that's not what he said. He just simply said, if that's the case, what does it matter for you? The point was, what does it matter to Peter, not the fact that John is not going to die. The one writing this gospel, verse 24, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. That we throws people off sometimes. Isn't John the apostle writing this gospel? How do we get a plural subject here? Who's the we? You should know that in the Greek, not in the English, but in the Greek, sometimes the plural is used for a singular editor. It's weird. We don't have that in English, but it does happen in the Greek, so it could be just John using that we. Some people have also hypothesized this. John writes probably from Ephesus because he was a leader in the church in Ephesus, and so most likely if he's sitting down to write a gospel, the elders in the church of Ephesus probably wanted to at least approve, let us read it over, let's check your work kind of a thing, make sure you're testifying to the things you know about. And so it's possible that this we could also be the elders of the church of Ephesus, overseeing his work. We know you want to write a gospel. You were there. You're an eyewitness. We want you to write an account, but we're just going to make sure that it's your story. And this could be their stamp of approval. We know that the one who wrote these things is the one testifying, and we know that his testimony is true. And so that you and I know that not everything in this gospel is meant to record all the deeds that Jesus did. Verse 25, there are also many others things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose not even the world itself would contain the books that would be written. And so John tells us specific. I didn't try to record everything. I didn't try to put everything in chronological order. I gave you this so that you might believe, not so that you can know all the details. Don't get stuck trying to figure out all the details. You should be at the end of this text saying to yourself, isn't this Peter's commission? Strategic, pastoral ministry. Love God, tend the sheep, then you're going to die. And the answer is yes. If you're reading this and you're thinking, this is Peter's story, tend the sheep, love God, become a martyr, is that my story? The answer is no. Probably not. What's the story for your life? If you're reading this and you're thinking, this is John's commission, a long life, John's going to write a large portion of the New Testament. None of us are going to get to write any of the New Testament. That's John's commission. How do we figure it out for our own life? First thing I'll give to you, how do you figure out your commission? How do you figure out the purpose of God for your life, your calling? First thing is come to your senses. Come to your senses. Every one of the disciples who had a relationship with God, who was given a commission, a calling, all of them first came to their senses. And goes back to the question that Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Can you sit back in your chair and simply say, yes, Lord, I love you? To the one who knows all things. You cannot find the purpose of God for your life if you're unwilling to accept the one he sent to save you. You won't find it. Second thing is this. You have to be willing to spend time with Jesus. For John and Peter, this was real easy. They sat with him, they ate with him, they walked with him. Real simple. Spend time with Jesus. For us, it seems a little bit more difficult. Does that mean reading my Bible? I mean, these are the words of God. The answer is possibly yes. Maybe that's the way you could find your calling. Is the answer praying to God and spending time communicating with him? The answer is yes. That could be a part of it. I'm always fascinated by this. There's people, how many of you have ever been on a church retreat or a camp or a mission trip or you went to Israel? Okay, there's almost everybody in the room. And any of you have the experience coming back from that of like mountaintop sort of experience? I really felt like I heard from God. I really felt like I experienced God. I talked to him. He talked to me. I heard from him. I felt close to him. Yes? Ever wonder why that is? I wonder why people wonder why that is. You have carved time out of your schedule. You have intentionally gone to meet with God. If you went on a trip that you paid money for, you spent time and money out of your finances. I mean, you said no to other things in your life so that you could meet with God and commune with him. You stood with other people and you worshiped with him. You got together with other believers and you prayed with them. And you're mind blown that you heard from God. And people say, how do I hear from God? How do I listen to him? Have you carved time out of your schedule to hear from God? Have you carved time out of your finances? Have you met with other believers? Have you prayed with them? Have you consulted them? Have you spent... Lots of people who go on retreats to say, well, I wandered off and I read my Bible. Oh, and I heard from God. It was amazing. Yeah. It's kind of how it works. I know it seems simple, but if you want to know, if you want to ask God, what is my purpose? What is my calling? And you want God to respond to you, you're going to have to spend time with him. Carve time out. And then expect that he'll speak with you. Expect that he'll speak with you. Why would God keep your calling from you? Why would he keep your commissioning from you? Why, if he wants you to be a functioning part of the body of Christ, to use your gifts to have purpose and meaning and fulfillment and success in your life, why would he keep that from you? Ask. The disciples didn't have to ask. Jesus was there knocking on their door saying, go get that fish, get over here, eat breakfast, here's your commission. Well, it's a little more difficult for us. We may have to ask, God, what's my purpose? I mean, I know I've been married and I've been doing the marriage thing and I love my wife or I love my husband and that's been giving me purpose in my life, but one day one of us is going to be gone. And if they go first, I'm going to be lost because I don't really know what you've called me to. I've just been trying to support my kids. Number 3 is go to Grand Canyon University. Did you know their tagline is find your purpose? This is a joke, by the way. This is not number 3. Don't write this down. It's not in your sermon guide. I was thinking about this. I was like, oh, just go to Grand Canyon University. It's real simple. Like, sign up, take student loans, and pay it back later. The irony, so I went to Grand Canyon University. I'm an alumni there. My wife is an alumni there. We just took our kids to an alumni event at Zoo Lights on Friday, and we dressed all of our kids up in alumni gear. So, like, they were like, oh, your family's crazy. Yeah, it was a blast. The irony is although the tagline is somewhat colloquial, I kind of did find my purpose there. I wasn't planning on being a pastor, and then I showed up to Grand Canyon University, and God's like, Christian Studies program. I was like, what? Anyways, you can take that down. That's not part of find your commission to God. Number 3, listen carefully. Listen carefully. Be open to anything. Peter had to be willing to sit there while Jesus spoke and listen carefully to what he was saying to him. Be open to anything. Peter, tend my sheep, shepherd my sheep. Oh, and by the way, you're going to die. Are you still willing to follow me? Listen carefully, be willing to do anything. He was a fisherman when he started, before God. He was a fisherman before he met with Jesus. And then Jesus told him, you're going to fish for men. Talk about life change. Listen carefully, be willing to do anything. Peter was just on a boat fishing, ends up becoming an evangelist. Fisherman, and God says, you, evangelist, go. To which Peter could have said, evangelist, what? I'm a fisherman. What are you talking about? Listen carefully, be willing to do whatever God asks you to do. Look for something that's not tied to a profession. Peter could have said, I'm a fisherman, I don't do evangelism. No. You can evangelize on the boat, buddy. You don't have to stop fishing. In the process of listening carefully and being open to anything, don't get stuck worrying about the plan of God for other people. Stay focused on what God has for you to do in your life. Last one, and then I'll share a story and then we'll be done. Last one is ask someone to help you find your purpose from God. This one's not in the text because they had Jesus standing in front of them. And he told them, notice the commission that Jesus gives to Peter. Tend my lambs, shepherd my sheep. Notice that's not tied to being a pastor in a church. It's not tied to a profession. It's not tied to being old or young. He can tend the sheep if he's 80, and he can tend the sheep if he's 25. He can tend the sheep if he's poor or rich. He can tend the sheep in jail or out of jail. Look for a commissioning, a calling that's not bound to money or not bound to your spouse, not bound to your kids. If he has kids, he can tend the sheep. If he has no kids, he can tend the sheep. Wife, no wife. Ask God for something that's going to ground you no matter what life throws at you and flips right and left. Here's why I say ask someone to help, pray for you, come alongside of you. Some of you know, I asked Ted if I could share this story, and he said yes. Some of you know that we're planning Ava's memorial service for this Friday. That's Ted's mother-in-law. Some of you know some of Ted's story. Some of you know that Ted's story's rough in some spots. I was talking to them about her life and how they've impacted her, how she's impacted them. And Ted said to me, when my life was rough, and it was rough, there was maybe 2 or 3 people in my life that stuck with me. Everybody else bailed. And he says, she was one of them. She was one of the ones who didn't matter what I did, she was always willing to welcome me. Oh, she didn't tell me what I was doing was right, but she was always willing to bring me in, give me a meal, and then tell me, you can't stay here. You got to go get your life in order. So one day, he comes to her, and he says, I want to marry your daughter. Now, she's a single mom, and so she's taking care of all the duties that parents do. And she says to him, Ted, how old were you at that time? 25. She says to him, you don't know how to love. So he says, I'm sitting there as a 25-year-old man, and I'm saying, who is this woman telling me that I don't know how to love? What are you talking about? I'm coming to you asking you if I can marry your daughter, and you're telling me I don't know how to love? And she tells him, you don't know how to love because you don't even know what love is because you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. See, you can't love my daughter the way you should because you don't know what love is, because you don't know who love is. And he said, when she told me, I thought she was crazy. No, I'm a 25-year-old guy. I walked out of there going, she's nuts. But looking back, he says she was right. And I figured it out. And eventually, I figured out that she was right. And I needed her to be able to be truthful with me. I needed her to help me find what my true purpose was. Because remember what I said earlier? Outside of having a relationship with Jesus Christ, you cannot know the purpose of God for your life. And so now he's sitting here going, part of the reason I even know the purpose of God for my life is because she was willing to help me find it. So I'm saying to you, I'm listening to the story of her influence of his life, and I'm saying to you, we need each other. It would be great if you could just crack open your Bible and be like, oh, that's my purpose from God, thanks. It would be great if you could just go to God and pray, and you could hear an audible voice, and you could just say, oh, God told me this is my purpose. This might be a little more complicated than that. We don't have Jesus, we have each other, and the Spirit of God living inside of believers, and so we ought to be able to speak with the Spirit of God into other people's lives and help them find their purpose, their calling. And so now he has a grounding for what it looks like to love people and to love them well in his life. Ted, there's a possibility that part of your calling is simply to love people and to love them well. It's been demonstrated for you. I think that you have a capacity for it that most people don't. Pray with me. God, would you speak to each one of us? This is very personal to each one of us. We're thankful that you would care for your children. We're thankful that you know each one of us intimately and intricately. God, we need your guidance. We need your leadership. We need your purpose in our life. God, give us something that grounds us. Don't let us walk into tragedy, losing a child, losing a spouse, losing a job. Don't let us walk into tragedy and flounder because we've been focused on something that is not our calling. God, this is unique to each one of us, and so I don't have the answers for everybody in the room as to what God has called each person to. So I'm asking you to speak clearly to each one of us. Thanks for your demonstration of redemption in Peter's life. Every one of us needs that. God, teach us by your Spirit, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.